Moving on to the 10-mark question, so 6D. Let's have a read of this. Assess the extent to which information gaps, which information gaps and irrational behaviour are the main causes of food waste in the UK. So the main thing I'm picking up from just reading the question, just exam technique, is that it's asking me about two separate things. So information gaps and irrational behaviour. So usually in a 10-mark question, you can get away with the 1K paragraph, but since it's asked you specifically about two separate aspects, I would make sure to split into two paragraphs. Of course, you don't need to go as detailed since you're doing two paragraphs, but 100% I would split it into two paragraphs. Now, just reading the question, the first thing I am actually going to look for is whether information gaps and irrational behaviour are actually the main causes of food waste, because it says assess the extent, so that kind of maybe tells me it's not, but it could be. And the second thing is, I usually say a lot of these section B questions, you should have enough economics theory, your economics knowledge should be good enough to just answer the question without looking at the context. But here, this is an example of a context question where you 100% need the context to pick up the marks here. Just like all of the questions, you do need the context for application, but here, I think it's quite hard to guess what the question's actually asking you here. So the question has directed us towards extract B, so let's have a read of that. So again, we're looking for the main causes of food waste in the UK and whether information gaps and irrational behaviour are the main causes of food waste. So extract B, so food waste in the supply chain. Let's have a read of this. So firstly, it says supermarkets are directly responsible for 0.2 million tonnes of food waste. So that's one of the causes, and I'm guessing that's one of the major causes of food waste. And then it tells us why they end up wasting food, so expiry dates. Okay, so then it says 4.1 million tonnes of food waste occurs, and this says due to the existence of information gaps. I'm just going to quickly skip this section and then look over to the second one, because of course the question said information gaps and irrational behaviour are the two main causes of food wastage, so let's just check that. So 7 million tonnes of food are wasted. This suggests irrational behaviour. So okay, so the question, we have now established that information gaps and irrational behaviour are the two main causes, but now going back to the question, it's asking us the extent, so assess the extent to which information gaps and irrational behaviour are the main causes of food waste. Now, I've got to admit, this is actually a bit of a harder question because I would say slightly poorly worded and there's not much economics theory to back it up. So here, what you're going to have to do is just use the context as much as possible. So I'm just going to read through that paragraph again because we're assessing the extent to which, we'll start with just information gaps, are a main cause of food wastage. There's not much, when you first look at it, there's not much economics theory to back that up with. But now let's have a read of the context. So we've read up until here. Now, this basically goes on to tell us how the supermarkets are looking to solve this information gap. And that is probably what I am actually going to write about. So the way I would do this is, okay, so just KA structure. So I would start with just a bit of knowledge. The knowledge would be defining information gaps. There's also different types of information gaps. There's asymmetrical information. For example, when you're buying a car, the seller of the car has a lot more information on the car than you as the buyer, as the seller has used the car. He knows probably ins and outs of the car, whilst you as a buyer can only judge the car and what he's presented, what he's presented to you. I define it by saying when one party in an information, so the buyer or the seller, does not have complete information to make an informed decision, therefore it leads to a misallocation of resources. Then I'll just have my topic sentence. I believe information gaps are the main cause of food wastage due to a lack of complete market information. And that is from this. The way I've got that is this line here. Basically, the supply and demand of food. So this involves improving forecasts for supply and demand of food. And what that is saying is that food is wasted due to information gaps, but due to basically that the supermarkets don't have complete market information, as they don't know how much to supply at certain seasons, as they do not know how much demand there will be. Therefore, they might oversupply, they might undersupply. Well, they will likely oversupply, thus leading to that excess supply is the food wastage. And that's basically how I would develop my chain of analysis. So just linking this sentence in the extract as much as possible to information gaps. So talking about the excess supply by supermarkets as they have a lack of market information, thus meaning that excess supply is of course food wastage. Then I would also flip it onto the consumer side. So consumers maybe demand too much food because things like they don't understand how like food labels work, they don't understand when food expires, thus they might just buy an excess amount of food as they don't fully understand the labels. A great example of this is like bread. Bread has a best before date, which might be in 3 days, but after those 3 days, you can still eat it, and there's a lot of times where the bread will be completely fine. It's just that an estimate of when the bread is in like prestige condition is in those 3-day period, but it doesn't go moldy. It's not unhealthy to eat that bread after 3 days, and that is probably, and giving something like that in an example, is what's leading to the excess demand, as individuals might just buy too much bread, as I think in this 3 days I'm only going to be able to eat this much, but then I need a new loaf of bread for those next, I don't know, 7 days. And like I said, this is definitely a bit of a harder 10-mark question, since there's not much economics theory, and it's a lot of just like inferences, a lot of just using the context and extracting as much as possible. And then of course your 10-mark question will have 4 marks reserved for application, so a little evaluation point at the end of this paragraph. And the one I would pick is 100% time frame, as it really is the easiest. I'll just talk about, however, in evaluation this depends on the time frame, as if we're talking about information gaps, we can say in the short run there's likely to be these information gaps, whereas in the long run, when these supermarkets over a longer period of time, when they gain more market information, where they've tried and tested different things like adjusting the supply and demand, they'll have a backlog of like statistics information which they can use, which will therefore reduce the information gap and almost solve the market failure, thus meaning there's no longer excess supply, thus solving the food wastage. So basically I'd word it something like, so however in evaluation this depends on whether the long run can solve the market failure or the information gap. Then moving on, like I said, we're going to do 2 paragraphs here since this question split them up, and this is on irrational behaviour, and this is much easier, as whenever you think of irrational behaviour, you should think of these 3 points. So, consumers may not behave rationally. Why? Number 1, consideration of influence of other people's behaviours. So, why can this lead to food wastage? So, for example, fashion trends, maybe a big influencer's buying lots of bread, and that's the only food I can think of. Maybe one influencer buying lots of bread, and now since people are seeing this influencer buy bread, since it's a trend, they end up buying bread, but then when they take that bread home, they realise they don't actually like bread. So due to the influence of other people, due to almost like herd behaviour, they start buying bread, and this leads to food wastage. Then secondly, the importance of habitual behaviour. So consumers might be used to buying too much food. They might be used to throwing away food every single week, but since it's a habit, they keep on doing it week on week, and it's very hard to break out those habits. Then lastly, consumer weakness at computation. This basically means the lack of mental processing power a human has when making a decision. So for example, the customer might be deciding whether to buy 1 loaf of bread or 2 loaf of breads, but since it's a hard decision and they don't fully know whether they're going to eat more bread this week, less bread this week, just to be safe, they'll probably pick 2 loaves of bread, but that will very likely lead to more wastage. So any one of those factors you can build a chain of analysis around. You can even throw in 2 of them or even all of them if you'd really like, and that would be enough for the 6 marks in your 10-mark question. And just to pick up those last 2 evaluation marks, I think a really easy evaluation here is just using like your previous point, just talking about a bit about providing information. So one way you can reduce irrational behaviour is by providing information. For example, just maybe prompting individuals saying, do you really need this many loaves of bread in a supermarket? Just having like a little sign, something like that, just providing information, maybe providing an average amount of bread that each household uses, therefore it helps with individuals' decision making, therefore them less likely to buying too much bread, and therefore leading to food wastage. And that is a wrap for the 10-mark question.